Furthermore, is there any non-biblical historical evidence of any person living with the name Jesus, the son of Mary, who traveled about with 12 followers, healing people and the like? There are numerous historians who lived in and around the Mediterranean either during or soon after the assumed life of Jesus. How many of these historians document this figure? Not one. However, to be fair, that doesn't mean defenders of the historical Jesus haven't claimed the contrary. 4 historians are typically referenced to justify Jesus' existence. Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and Tacitus are the first 3.
Unlike these mythical deities, the documentation for a historical Jesus is actually more compelling than the documentation for other ancient figures like Confucius and Buddha. Peter Joseph makes several false statements here. First of all, none of these historians mentioned were defenders of the historical Jesus. They were secular or non-Christian sources. In consideration of the lack of attention paid by the ancient Greco-Roman world to the humble beginnings of Christianity and Jesus being a Jewish figure in a remote location on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire, and was therefore of little interest to the Roman historians writing Roman literature, there is a considerable amount of historical evidence that confirms his existence. There are not just 4 historical references for Jesus' existence as Zeitgeist boldly alleges, but in fact, 42 authors mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. On the contrary, only 10 authors mention Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor during Jesus' ministry within 150 years of his life. If liberal scholars applied the same arbitrary standard of rejection of historical evidence to other ancient historical personages besides Jesus, such as Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, they would be forced to reject all history as myth. It is for this reason the brilliant historian F.F. Bruce wrote, "The historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar." Tacitus was governor of Asia in AD 112 and was known as the greatest historian of ancient Rome. In his Annals of Imperial Rome, Tacitus wrote about Emperor Nero's persecution of the Christians. He says, "To suppress therefore the common rumor, Nero procured others to be accused and inflicted exquisite punishments upon those people who were in abhorrence for their crimes and were commonly known as Christians. They had their denomination from Christus, Christ, who in the reign of Tiberius was put to death as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate. This pernicious superstition, though checked for a while, broke out again and spread not only over Judea, the source of this evil, but reached the city Rome also."
Each one of their entries consists of only a few sentences at best, and only referred to Christus or the Christ, which in fact is not a name but a title. It means the anointed one.
Zeitgeist disregards Tacitus's reference to Jesus based on the title Christus. But how many Christs were there who were crucified under Pontius Pilate? This witness directly corresponds to the gospel record of Jesus. Christus was Greek for Christ. These historical accounts do not only refer to Christ, as Zeitgeist alleges, but give us much more information, which also concludes that the Christus in view must be Jesus. For example, such historical documents confirm that Jesus was executed as a criminal under the authority of Pontius Pilate, who ruled Judea and under the reign of Emperor Tiberius. History provides proof that the Christians who began in Judea spread through the Roman Empire and suffered great persecution for their faith, and that these Christians derived their worship and religion from the person known as Christ, or the Messiah. All of these details parallel the gospel accounts validating that Jesus is in view here. Suetonius was the official historian during the reign of both Emperor Trajan and Adrian. Speaking of the Emperor Claudius, who ruled from AD 41 to 54, he wrote, "He banished the Jews from Rome, who were continually making disturbances, Chrestus being their leader." The name Chrestus is another spelling for the name Christ or Christus. This statement from Suetonius also confirms the passage in the Bible within the book of Acts chapter 18 about the exiling of the Jews from Rome during the reign of Claudius. Suetonius also recounts that punishment by Nero was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new mischievous superstition. Suetonius confirms that Christians were suffering and dying for their conviction that Jesus had lived, died, and risen from the dead. A mischievous superstition, as he called it, not being a Christian. Pliny the Younger was governor of the Roman provinces of Pontus and Bithynia in AD 101 to 110. In a letter to the emperor, Pliny the Younger requested specific instructions about the interrogations of Christians whom he was persecuting. He said he made them curse Christ, which a genuine Christian cannot be induced to do. He continued, "They affirmed, however, that the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verse a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves to a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify their word, not to deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up." Are we to believe that within 2 generations, fake characters were now being treated as historical people?
The fourth source is Josephus, and this source has been proven to be a forgery for hundreds of years. Sadly, it is still cited as truth.
Josephus, the Jewish historian, is known for historical works such as Jewish Antiquities, finished in AD 93 or 94. One passage reads, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day." This is the passage that has raised heated debate among scholars because Josephus, a non-Christian Jew, makes statements about Jesus that an Orthodox Jew would not normally affirm. While some Christian additions may have been obviously foreign to the text, it still contains a great deal of historical truth that Josephus could have easily documented. In fact, the vast majority of scholars do not dismiss the account as a forgery, as Zeitgeist alleges, but believe that Josephus did mention Jesus in this passage, but later insertions were made by a Christian scribe, hence the statements about Jesus that a non-Christian like Josephus wouldn't have made. But the style of Josephus is authentic. The term wise man, for example, is typical for Josephus's writings. Zeitgeist's accusation that this text is a forgery is an exaggeration. Moreover, there is another reference to Jesus in Josephus's work that is not disputed by scholars, proving that Jesus was an historical figure. He says, "But the younger Ananus, who, as we said, received the high priesthood, was of bold disposition and exceptionally daring. He followed the party of the Sadducees, who are severe in judgment above all the Jews, as we have already shown. As therefore Ananus was of such a disposition, he thought he had now a good opportunity, as Festus was now dead, and Albinus was still on the road. So he assembled a council of judges, and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others, and having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned." So this great first-century non-biblical historian Josephus, writing just a little more than 50 years after Jesus' life and crucifixion, attests that Jesus had a brother named James and was a real historical figure.
You would think that a guy who rose from the dead and ascended into heaven for all eyes to see and performed the wealth of miracles acclaimed to him would have made it into the historical record. It didn't, because once the evidence is weighed, there are very high odds that the figure known as Jesus did not even exist.
Again, there are not only 4 historical sources for Jesus' existence as Zeitgeist boldly claims, but 42 authors mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. We don't have time to quote them all. Expert on world religions, ancient Christianity, and church history, Robert E. Van Voorst says, "The theory of Jesus' non-existence remains effectively dead as a scholarly question." Again, Zeitgeist misinterprets the Bible, saying Jesus ascended into heaven for all eyes to see. The book of Acts chapter 1 describes Jesus' ascension in front of a very small group of people. To disregard or disbelieve his miracles and resurrection is one thing, but to claim that he never existed in the face of all the evidence is a premise rejected by even non-Christian historians and scholars. Richard Burridge and Graham Gould state that the questioning of Jesus' existence is not accepted by mainstream critical scholarship. Robert Van Voorst has stated, "The non-historicity thesis has always been controversial, and it has consistently failed to convince scholars of many disciplines and religious creeds. Biblical scholars and classical historians now regard it as effectively refuted."